We come to Chapter 18, The Explosion. Brian noticed the trail of smoke, tiny as it was at a distance, and at once associated it with the smell of gunpowder. He dropped the dynamite wrappings where he had picked them up and started running towards the smoke. He didn't know why he was running, it just seemed urgent. He stumbled over clods and boulders turned up by bulldozers, circled round one of the abortive drill holes for water, and then round the ruts made by the jeeps. Towards the edge of the fieldstone, the jeep track faintly left the main rut. It broke above ground. By now he was about 100 yards from the spot where yesterday he had left the stream bed and come into the open. Just beyond the opening in the fence was the slight hole that later developed into the stream bed, and beyond another 100 yards was the ridging of the hillside as the ground moved upwards again. It was on the ridging that the clump of trees stood, with the boulder in the middle hidden from Brian, and the wisp of smoke curling through the tallest tree. You could see beyond the clump into the field beyond, and there, running drunkenly and shouting, was his brother Kevin. He increased his own pace and began to cut up across the ridging embankment to meet Kevin, if he could. He was quite sure, even at this distance, that Kevin was quite out of his mind. From the moment Kevin noticed the putrid animal decaying smell, he hardly knew what he was doing. He was in fact running down through the grasses, along much of the same path his sisters had taken the day before after finishing the ice cream course of their picnic lunch. But it did not seem so to him. The first thing that Kevin saw with his eyes was the huge wall of the glacier. Its base was far away, at least a quarter of a mile, but instead of a gradual slope of ice moving backward from the rubble, the mud of the lake it had formed, there was a huge blue-green cliff of ice. As he looked at it, it seemed to hang over him, and he heard the great clashes like thunder. Great cracks appeared in the ice. It was hundreds of feet high, and as the sun at high noon was dazzling and blinding, below him and around him were the low woods, and from somewhere ahead there was an appalling shriek. He was crashing as fast as he could through the jungle-like bush and the trees, and as he ran he seemed to grow larger or the trees smaller, and again he was aware that the smell came not from the tall tree ahead of him, but from himself. There was also another odor as of burning, which he recognized as separate from this strange body stench. It was again as he had been, coming out of the glacier with Brian, and even as he had seen the family of huge creatures on that beach. He seemed to be one himself, hairy, flat-footed, squeaking rather than speaking. And there was Brian, or rather that other Brian, beast-like as he was himself, running along the beach, shouting and squealing at him. But he was paying no attention to Brian, but to the great rock by the tall tree, and to the shrieks he heard coming from there. Someone very dear to him was there, someone he must rescue, someone only he could find and help. He rushed on. As he rushed, he realized that the tree was not as tall as he thought, but the rock was larger than he thought. Then there was a huge noise, as though the whole cliff face of the glacier, far away as it was breaking all and crashing down and going to fall on top of him and the precious person he was rescuing. But indeed, instead of ice falling, although the thunder from side to side was like a glacial boom, the beach rose up before him like a huge spout. Trees and water and rocks were flung in the air. The mass of ice and pebbles and mud was upon him, but the explosion continued far above his head. Yet he kept running, knowing he must break through to whoever was waiting for him. Debbie had been dancing through the lovely bushes with her big sister in tow, for it seemed an age, but they could not get behind the mountain. They were hardly touching the ground, and seemed to be travelling very fast, but making little progress. It was exasperating, but the only frustration was an otherwise delightful frolic. The sky was very bright, the mountain shone gold and silver and diamond, with even its deep scar lit up by the overhead sun. The sun itself seemed twice as large as usual, so that the light itself was a steady glow. The parts of her body that were for even a moment shaded by her flying arms, or the shadow of her head, was suddenly chilled, even in fleeting shade. And at that point she noticed that neither she nor Linda had any clothes on, but were covered with a soft yellow down. She felt as if she remembered feeling when she was very little, and Mummy had put everyone in the bath together, and she felt that lovely warmth of the water and its softness on her skin, and wondered at the bigness of her brothers and sisters as they splashed the water at each other. In spite of the heat, the air was crisp and fragrant, and there was still a burning smell, but it was the incense, a burning before the fireplace of old flowers and cedar bark. Then she saw the fire. It was like a circle or a globe, quite small at first, and still on the other side of the mountain. In other tongues were tangerine, leaping and crisscrossing, just like, not just leaping up like a log fire, but leaping in all directions around the central hall. Closer in the glow was a drop of red, redder than any toy fire truck, redder than blood and moving like liquid. In the very center of this was a silvery white star with 4 points, which shrunk and grew again like the beating of a heart. The whole fire grew larger and larger, till it was the size of the mountain itself, through which she was seeing it as through a crystal. Then, as the tongues of orange slept out beyond the mountain, back into the blue sky, everything moved. The whole world was shaking, back and forth, in and out, and rising up. They themselves were rising up higher, far above the ground. She knew now that at any moment everything would turn like a page of a book. When Linda pulled her hand, she looked at her sister. All of a sudden, all the beauty had left her as fear and pain distorted her face. Linda's eyes opened wide. She threw back her head and screamed. Debbie clutched her, hugging her, trying to tell her everything was all right. But she screamed again, and they were both lifted like floating, but with a great jolt, and where everything beautiful had been silent, now noise was everywhere. Skip Martin and Sam Hagerman had soon found out that the radio news flash was false, but there was no assurance to be had in the village of the little girl's safety. They'd gone their separate ways very shortly. Sam Hagerman to witness the council session and to make an appearance for the sake of his voters. Skip to find some of the saner heads in the community and try to discover what might be known about the girl's disappearance. Tom Bird at the Beehive Grocery was his best source of information. Tom was a bright, cheerful man who had brought his family up from the city, trying his fortune as a country storekeeper. He had soon won his way among conservative country folk by the good manners and his willingness to go out of his way to help. We first heard about it yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Scace, the mayor's wife, called round everywhere asking about the girls, and we sent our youngster off looking for them. By supper time it began to look pretty serious, and the police and the whole countryside were turning out to look. It seems the girls took a picnic lunch down the hill, down Scace's hill, that is, and just disappeared. Which way down Scace's hill? Asked Skip. Oh, this way towards the village, or at least on the direct road to Norham. They went into some field near the spring. The Scace kids all play around. Has there been anyone there today at all? Asked Chip. No, not really, but all these visitors have kept us all busy. Been hard to pay attention. Triple O lot, eh? Have they been helping in the search? As far as I know, nobody's even told them about the girls. How come the Triple O people aren't at the Triple O site? They're not ready. They've been digging for weeks that they can't get any water, just dried up. And how did you get to the lot anyway? They built a road, but they keep the gate locked on the number 25 bypass. You're driving there, go down by the farm road, see this side, by the side of the slaughterhouse. Oh yes, it's Tom's boy, right across from Hell's Door. Sam, don't call it that. What's it mean, Hell's Door? It means the mausoleum let into the hillside of the cemetery where they keep the coffins in winter until the ground can be opened. Skip laughed. He has a dim view of where Warkworth people will wake up. I think he kind of likes the idea. Kids are always interested in things like that. Tom, do you know if the Triple O site was searched? They searched, they were told about it. I don't know whether the foreman did a search. Around here, people get up and look for lost kids without being asked much. Nearly. Is there anyone up there now, do you please suppose? Saturday? Not likely. And the brass will all be trying to deal with the mob. Outside, the march to lunch had begun, and Skip had come out of the beehive in time to see the minister bringing up the street, bringing up the rear, beaming and waving. Skip didn't have much time for that. He decided to take a look for himself at the O site. He would check up on what Albert had told him about the outfit at the same time. Reaching what Sam Bird called Hell's Door, he turned left along the farm road. At the house, he paused for a few words with the owner, friendly widow, and her son. "Anyone been doing here searching for those girls?" "We did a search ourselves, but only on our own land. What about the O land?" Mrs. Jake's brow darkened. "Those people? I wouldn't expect nothing from them. Ignorant lot. Don't suppose they gave it a thought. Did you see any sign of a search party over there?" "Not at all." "Honk your horn 3 times if you need some help." "Okay, will do." "Okay, thanks." Skip jumped in his car and drove furiously down the cattle track. Once he reached the woods, he got out and began a painstaking search, moving back and forth across the grounds and through the trees in sweeping lines, prying under piled leaves and branches, checking out every hole. Thus it was nearly noon when he began to smell the faint aroma of gunpowder in the air, and by that time he was on the edge of the cleared site of the O Lodge. It was at this very moment that Kevin was plunging down the field, shouting crazily, and Brian decided to take a shortcut to him. Skip did not see either child at this point, but he heard the children shouting and ran in the direction of the sound, jumping over piles of earth and scrambling to the edge of the clearing and to the treed field boundary. He had just crossed this and located the shouting boys when the explosion took place, so he was the only adult eyewitness who could later tell of the subsequent events. The clump of pines concealing the large rock was about a quarter of a mile from where Skip Martin had broken through the fence. It was just far away enough for there to be a split second between what he saw and the noise he heard. The noise, coming just a little later, helped imprint the extraordinary sight on his memory. He had seen explosions before in his war service, but this, it turned out, was not solely an explosion of dynamite. As his memory recorded it, there was a stillness in which everything was etched on his mind. The clump of trees was located on the ridging of the lower hillside, just above the ridge, and more than 100 yards from this side of the clump was the small figure of a running boy. To the west of the ridge and up the field towards Scace's hill, there was a movement in the field as of someone running, and shouts were coming from that direction. The shouts were what attracted his attention. There was a shift of the whole scene, as if he had been looking through an old handmade window pane with a flaw, or as if he had touched the side of his eye and made the whole retinal picture move. The movement was a shift to the left, away from Scace's hill, partly towards himself. Thinking about it later, he could not get away from the idea that everything had moved about 25 feet in that direction. However, that was the first and general movement he saw. The second was more specific. The clump of trees moved straight up into the air, and there was a stir of rocks and earth along the ridging on each side of the clump, a stir that ended in a mushroom of smoke and debris that moved laterally and horizontally east from the explosion while the trees flew upward vertically. Then he heard the noise. First there was a thump, and then the reverberations and echoes began. That should have been the end of it, but a new roar began coming from inside the earth, and Martin recognized the sound of water. At the moment of the explosion, Brian was flat on his face. He had just stumbled over a fallen branch and was momentarily winded, so he thought the noise was an illusion from the thump of his fall. Then he realized that the noise was continuing, and that the trees in that clump were blowing straight into the air. By now he was much closer to Kevin, but Kevin was nearly at the trees. He looked sharp to see any sign of Kevin, but could only see smoke and dust curling from the ground. He was not even sure where the tree clump had been, except that it seemed to be the center of the continuing noise. The ground was trembling under his feet. If he had stood still instead of running, he could have known it was heaving. Certainly, as each foot landed, the earth seemed to push back, so that his strides became like moon steps, huge. He ran to the center of the confusion. To his left, there was greater noise and more smoke before him. He could just make out that some shrubs and small trees, the foliage ripped from them. Kevin must be in there somehow. Then he saw the rock. He remembered it. Always a lover of cool, enclosed spaces, he had spent many an hour sitting near it, with the trees overhead, wondering at the strange, deep claw marks on its side. To him, they were claw marks made by some rock-mauling creature of another age. It was a beautiful rock, moss on its north side, and some of the granite sufficiently rough and unweathered to sparkle with little crystals. It had been one of his favorite sights, but he had hardly ever associated it with Kevin and Bart's story of the jeep and the man they attacked. Now, it was quite different. The trees around it were gone, and it towered over the edge of the field with a grim grayness that made it seem almost unrecognizable. Behind it, on the downside, there seemed to be a continuing explosion, and amid the dust and smoke, he recognized a more solid matter, something swirling water, like mud and gravel. The ridging of the field had become the shore, for beyond was a flood of waters. There was still too much smoke to notice how far it extended. Anyway, his attention was on what was between the rock and himself. The force of the explosion had all been on the east side of the rock. The big trees with their roots north and south of the rock had been blown up, but in the shelter of that rock, even shoulder-high bushes were undisturbed, except for a coming coating of dust. And there, lying still peacefully asleep, were his two sisters, but not for long. For to his right, crawling through bushes and thorns that had felt the blast of the dynamite, covered with mud and with blood on his face, came Kevin, still shouting with a hoarse croak his indistinguishable words. As the girls stirred, Brian ran to his brother and called his name, shaking him and raising him to his feet. "Kev, you found the girls. They're okay." "Whoa!" The human consciousness returned to the boy's eyes. "Help me with them quick. What happened to you, Kevin?" It was Linda's voice as she sat up. Apart from the coating of dust, she looked as though she had just finished a nice snooze in the shade. Kevin staggered over to her. "What happened to you, you mean? Everybody's been looking for you for 2 days, and we thought you were kidnapped or dead." "The mountain," shouted Debbie, waking slightly. "We're coming round the mountain." "Oh, shush, Daffy, we were asleep," said Linda, very much the older sister. "What do you mean 2 days? What day is it?" "It's Sunday, Linda." "And Brian," said Brian, "nobody's seen you since you went for that picnic lunch." "It couldn't be Saturday. We just lay down for a nap. Hey, what's that noise?" By now she was on her feet and could see the destruction around her. "But, Lindy, you were dancing round the mountain." Debbie insisted. "You were dreaming. Let's see what happened. Let's get out of here before we get drowned. Look at the flood," said Brian. The children edged round on one side of the rock. The dust and smoke were settling, but the water was rising, and it stretched as far as the eye could see. It filled all the area between the ridging of the field and the rise where the orchard had been destroyed by the Triple O. The excavations and piles of building blocks were disappearing. Where Brian had sat in a tree, eavesdropping on Bondworthy, only the top of the trees showed. Some of the drill holes from the abortive wells were spouting water with artesian force. "Wow," said Brian. "Let's get home quick." "Brian," said Kevin, "it's just what we saw the night of the fog." "Come on, you guys," said Linda, or we'll have to rescue you instead of you rescuing us. The Scaces, having started the morning later and spent a tearful hour with Mrs. Yorchuk, divided their duties. Albert spent his time on the phone, frantically trying to reach his brother, who was unreachable, and the police, who knew nothing, and his various neighbors, who were either out on the search or doing farm work or carting in rubbish for the upcoming Donnybrook sale. The women got the house in order and prepared food. For whatever the outcome, happy or tragic, there would be people to feed. So all were unaware that noon hour had struck. But they heard the explosion. The whole hill seemed to rock beneath them, and they all, from their various parts of the house, rushed outside. "Albert, there's flooding down by Letcher's North Field." "Flooding?" Albert rushed back to the kitchen with his binoculars. "It's a big flood. Where could all that water come from?" "What about these little girls? Where is that water?" said the mother. Albert was running at the thought and called over his shoulder, "I'm going to the other side of the track. You better see better from there." A few minutes later, the two women caught up with him. He was beyond the trees of the road allowance, where the edge of the escarpment continued. Not far below were the trees and bushes around the toy village in its spring. "There they are," said Albert. "All 4 children." "No, darling, where? Give me the glasses." She took the binoculars and looked. Coming across the field were her 4 children. Debbie, as usual, was dancing along in front. But both Linda and Brian seemed to have to help Kevin. He was a mess and apparently had hurt himself. Then, as she adjusted the lens further and the picture waved around, she saw a man running towards them. "Who's that?" She handed the glass back to Albert. "It's Skip Martin. That's who it is." End of chapter 18.